In every journey of growth, there's a moment before the moment. A moment when everything is still, when the world is quiet, and all you have is a spark inside you, waiting to awaken. It's a spark you may not always see, a spark others may overlook, but it never disappears. It grows in silence, gathers strength in the shadows, and prepares you for something greater. And then, the first crack appears. A crack in old habits, a crack in old beliefs, a crack in the story you were told about your limits. That crack widens, your perspective shifts, your vision sharpens, and suddenly, there's no going back. Because once you see your potential, you cannot deny it. The spark becomes a surge, the surge becomes a wave, and the wave becomes a burst of pure possibility, breaking through every layer of doubt, every barrier, every shadow that once held you down. In that burst, something new emerges, a new identity, a new posture, a new sense of purpose. You stand taller, clearer, stronger. And from that moment on, you don't walk into the future the same way. You step forward with confidence, with intention, with the power to transform not just your work, but your life. This is your awakening. This is where your transformation begins. You've now reached the final phase of this journey, not the end of learning, but the beginning of application. Across this season, we've built something deliberately. We explored why change fails, even when intentions are strong. We examined execution, how work actually moves. We addressed capability, whether systems can carry the load. We surfaced culture, the unseen force steering behavior. And we introduced performance intelligence, the layer that lets leaders see truth early while there's still time to act. In this episode, everything comes together. This is where models become tools, where insights become routines, where leadership becomes operational. The Change Leaders Toolkit isn't about inspiration, it's about control, over drift, over friction, over silent failure. By the end of this episode, you'll have a complete, integrated system you can apply to any team, any function, or any organization. Not someday, but immediately. This is the moment where understanding turns into leadership. Let's build the tools. This episode exists for one reason. Everything you've learned so far was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. Across this season, you've learned why change fails. You've seen how execution breaks down. You've learned that capability limits behavior. You've uncovered how culture silently shapes outcomes. And you've seen how performance intelligence allows leaders to detect trouble before failure becomes visible. But understanding change is not the same as operating change. Most leadership programs stop at concepts. They explain frameworks. They describe models. They discuss ideas. And then they leave leaders alone to figure out what to do on Monday morning. This episode is different. This is where knowledge becomes instrumentation, where insight turns into routines, where leadership turns into a system, not a personality trait. You already understand what goes wrong. Now we focus on how leaders actually run change, day by day, decision by decision, under real pressure. This episode exists to close the gap between knowing and doing. This is the moment where leaders stop learning concepts and start operating change. Before we move forward, it's worth pausing for a moment to recognize what you've already built. This season wasn't a collection of disconnected ideas. It was a deliberate construction. You started by understanding why change actually fails. Not the myths, not the motivational narratives, but the real systemic causes. You learned to see execution not as effort, but as a system that either allows work to move or quietly blocks it. You reframed capability, not as talent or training, but as load capacity, what a system can actually carry before strain turns into failure. You explored culture, not as values on a wall, but as behavioral reinforcement, the forces that decide what gets repeated and what disappears. You added performance intelligence, the ability to see early signals, friction, and drift before damage shows up on dashboards. You watched teams recover. You studied pressure at the enterprise level. And across every episode, one truth stayed consistent. Nothing in this series stood alone. Each episode built the foundation for what comes next. What you've built so far is an integrated understanding of how change actually works in real organizations. And now we move from understanding to operating. Up to this point, we've talked about execution, capability, culture, and performance intelligence as individual forces. This slide is where they come together. The mission-ready framework is not a philosophy, and it's not another leadership diagram to memorize. It's a change engine, a system leaders actively operate in real time. Execution is how work moves, not effort, movement. Priorities, handoffs, flow, and completion. When execution breaks, nothing else matters. Capability is whether the system can carry the load. Skills, capacity, tools, and support. When capability is misaligned, teams compensate, burn out, or bypass the system entirely. Culture is how behavior is reinforced. What gets rewarded, what gets avoided, and what happens when pressure hits. Culture doesn't live in value statements. It lives in repeated behavior under stress. And then there's performance intelligence. PI is what allows leaders to see the system while it's still forming outcomes, not after the damage has already occurred. It detects drift, strain, hesitation, and fracture before metrics turn red. These four elements do not operate independently. Execution without capability produces heroics. Capability without execution produces frustration. Culture without systems produces inconsistency. And without PI, leaders are blind to all of it until it's too late. When the engine is aligned, change stabilizes. When one component fails, the entire system compensates until it can't. This framework is how you stop reacting to failure and start operating change deliberately, predictably, and sustainably. Pause here. Let the diagram breathe. Having worked through the full journey of this series, you understand the model. Leaders usually reach an important but dangerous assumption. I understand the model, so now I'm ready to lead change. And that's where most failures still begin. The reality is this: most leaders already know what needs to be fixed. They see execution problems, they recognize capability gaps, they feel cultural tension. What they don't have is a systematic way to intervene under pressure. When stress rises, leaders don't default to theory, they default to habits. Meetings get reactive, decisions get rushed, communication becomes inconsistent, and behavior reverts to whatever the system quietly rewards. This is why intelligence isn't the separator between successful and failed change. Structure is. Tools matter because they remove reliance on memory, motivation, and personal discipline. Tools create repeatability. They stabilize behavior. They force alignment even when leaders are tired, distracted, or under pressure. Without tools, execution depends on heroics. Capability depends on individuals compensating. Culture depends on personalities. And PI remains unused because no one has time to look. With tools, leadership becomes mechanical, in the best sense of the word. Predictable, transferable, sustainable. This episode exists because knowing the engine is not enough. You need the instruments. The difference between change success and failure is rarely intelligence. It's structure. This is where the series changes character. Up to now, we've been building understanding. Why change fails, how execution breaks down, why capability limits matter, how culture quietly reinforces behavior, and how performance intelligence reveals what dashboards hide. But understanding alone doesn't move work. The Change Leaders Toolkit exists for one reason: to convert everything you've learned into something you can operate under pressure. This is not a framework you hang on the wall. It's not a maturity model. It's not a checklist. It's an operating system. a system designed to help leaders diagnose reality instead of guessing, to intervene intentionally instead of reacting emotionally, and to maintain consistency when pressure, time constraints, and competing priorities hit all at once. The toolkit is diagnostic first. You don't start with solutions, you start with signals. It's modular. You don't apply everything at once, you apply what the system demands. And it's built for real environments, messy teams, conflicting incentives, incomplete data, human behavior under strain. This toolkit doesn't make leadership easier, it makes leadership repeatable. And that distinction is the difference between leaders who inspire and leaders who actually deliver change that lasts. Execution is where change lives or dies, and it almost never collapses all at once. It erodes quietly. Priorities blur, barriers linger unresolved, handoffs degrade, people compensate instead of escalating, and leaders don't see the failure forming because the system still appears functional. The execution toolkit exists for one reason: to force clarity under pressure. These tools don't motivate people, they don't inspire harder work. They do something far more important. They structure work so that effort actually converts into outcomes. Operating rhythms replace chaos with cadence. Priority alignment prevents energy from fragmenting across competing demands. Barrier removal tools turn problems into signals instead of frustrations. Clean handoff structures eliminate the silent rework that drains capacity. And load balance tools expose when performance is being held together by individual heroics. This is not about speed, it's about flow. Execution fails silently first. These tools are designed to make friction visible early, while leaders still have time to intervene. Because if execution isn't engineered, it will always default to stress, workarounds, and eventual breakdown. Capability is where most change efforts quietly break. Not because people aren't committed, but because the system cannot carry the load leaders place on it. Great people compensate. They take on work that doesn't belong to them. They bridge gaps that should never exist. They work longer hours to cover broken handoffs, unclear processes, and missing support. And for a while, it looks like the change is working, until it doesn't. Capability failure doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like increasing rework. It looks like small errors multiplying under pressure. The capability toolkit forces leaders to ask a harder question. Is this system actually designed to succeed, or is it surviving on individual heroics? These tools allow leaders to align skills to work intentionally instead of assuming availability equals capability. They surface where processes fracture under pressure. They make support visible, tools, knowledge, authority, instead of assumed. Most importantly, they allow leaders to see when load exceeds capacity before burnout, breakdown, or failure appears. Execution makes work move forward. Capability determines whether that forward motion is sustainable. You don't fix burnout with motivation. You fix it by engineering a system that can actually carry what you ask it to carry. Most leaders talk about culture as if it's something people have. But culture isn't values, it isn't posters, it isn't what leaders say in town halls. Culture is behavior, especially under pressure. It's what people do when deadlines tighten. It's how teams react when something goes wrong. It's who speaks up and who stays silent. It's what gets corrected and what gets tolerated. That's why culture doesn't drift because people forget what matters. It drifts because leaders stop engineering it. Every organization has reinforcement loops running all the time. Something happens, someone reacts or doesn't. A behavior is rewarded, ignored, or punished, and the system learns. One tolerated shortcut rewrites the rules. One unchallenged outburst signals what's acceptable. One time, speed is praised over quality reshapes priorities everywhere. Culture isn't shaped by speeches. It's shaped by friction, response, and consistency. That's what this toolkit focuses on. Not motivating people, not inspiring slogans, but engineering the conditions where the right behaviors repeat, even under stress. When leaders design reinforcement intentionally, culture stabilizes. When they don't, culture will still evolve, just not in the direction you intended. Performance intelligence is the difference between reacting to failure and preventing it. Most organizations believe they are data-driven. In reality, they are metric-dependent, and metrics arrive after damage has already occurred. Dashboards report outcomes. Performance intelligence observes conditions. PI focuses on the earliest signals systems produce, not numbers but behaviors. Micro delays, hesitation, workarounds, silent rework, escalation that slows or disappears altogether. These signals emerge long before missed deadlines, turnover, morale collapse, or quality failures. Performance intelligence gives leaders a new kind of visibility, not into performance results, but into system strain. It answers questions traditional dashboards cannot. Where is work starting to slow, quietly? Where are people compensating instead of performing? Where is load exceeding capacity? Where is drift forming before culture shifts? PI also restores escalation discipline. Problems no longer wait to become emergencies. Signals rise early, move predictably, and get addressed while correction is still low cost. With performance intelligence, leaders stop being surprised. They stop managing after the fact, and they regain the most important leadership advantage there is: time. That is why PI is not a reporting tool. It is a leadership sensing system. Dashboards tell you what happened. Performance intelligence tells you what's about to happen, while you still have time to shape the outcome. Every tool you've seen in this episode works on its own, but no tool was designed to operate alone. Execution without capability creates burnout. Capability without culture creates frustration. Culture without execution creates theater. And without performance intelligence, leaders lose sight of the system entirely. The real power move isn't choosing the right tool. It's integrating them into one operating engine. When execution is structured, capability is aligned, culture is engineered, and PI is active, something important happens. The system begins correcting itself. Leaders stop chasing symptoms. Teams stop compensating silently. Drift stops hiding. This is where change stops depending on heroics and starts relying on structure. Integration is what turns effort into endurance. It's what allows organizations to absorb pressure without breaking. Change doesn't last because people try harder. Change lasts because the system was designed to sustain it. Most change initiatives don't collapse because leaders lack commitment. They collapse because of a few predictable leadership errors, mistakes that feel reasonable in the moment but are destructive over time. The first is treating effort as the problem. When pressure rises, leaders often assume people just need to try harder, more urgency, more accountability, more push. But effort rarely fixes systemic friction. It only masks it temporarily. The second failure is waiting for metrics. Leaders tell themselves they'll intervene once the data confirms an issue. But by the time traditional metrics move, the damage is already done. Burnout, disengagement, and drift always appear long before numbers catch up. Another common failure is delegating culture. Leaders treat culture as something HR owns, or something the team should work out. In reality, culture is shaped by what leaders tolerate, reinforce, and respond to every single day. Then there's allowing drift to return. A change effort stabilizes, leaders relax, old habits creep back in quietly. The system doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes in small, ignored moments. And finally, solving functionally instead of systemically. Leaders fix isolated parts, a process here, a team there, without addressing how execution, capability, culture, and signals interact. Local fixes feel productive, but they often move the problem elsewhere. None of these failures come from bad intent. They come from incomplete systems. Sustainable change doesn't require heroic leadership. It requires disciplined, structured leadership, especially after momentum begins. Up to this point, we've walked through tools, execution tools, capability tools, culture tools, performance intelligence tools. But leaders don't succeed by owning tools. They succeed by assembling them into something coherent. This is where the real work begins, building your own change playbook. A playbook is not a document, it's not a checklist, and it's definitely not a framework you copy from someone else. A true change playbook is an operating system designed for your organization, under your pressures, with your constraints. This is why one-size-fits-all change models fail. They ignore context. Your organization has a specific execution rhythm, a specific capability profile, a specific culture under pressure, and a specific pattern of drift. Your playbook must reflect that reality. The process always follows the same sequence, but the design never does. First, diagnose. You don't guess, you observe. You read the system, execution signals, capability load, cultural behaviors, PI indicators. Second, stabilize. Before you fix anything, you stop the bleeding. You remove friction, reduce overload, and restore control. Third, reset. Execution resets, capability realignments, cultural reinforcement changes. And finally, reinforce. You build routines, rhythms, and signals that keep the system from drifting back. This is the difference between change that feels impressive and change that actually lasts. A toolkit gives you options. A playbook gives you discipline. Your job as a change leader is not to memorize the model. It's to engineer the system. All the tools in this series point to one unavoidable truth. Sustainable change is never limited by the system alone. It is limited by the leader operating it. The execution toolkit matters. Capability matters. Culture matters. Performance intelligence matters. But none of these tools function independently of leadership discipline. Change-capable leaders do three things differently. First, they practice self-diagnosis before system diagnosis. They ask, what behaviors am I reinforcing? Where do I hesitate? Where do I tolerate drift? They understand that their reactions, not their intentions, shape the system. Second, they operate on practice rhythms, not motivation. Change leadership is not episodic. It is daily, weekly, predictable. Leaders who wait for urgency lose change momentum. Leaders who build rhythm make change inevitable. Third, they learn to recognize patterns instead of reacting to events. They stop fighting yesterday's fires and start reading today's signals: hesitation, silence, load distortion, behavioral friction. And finally, they apply behavioral discipline under pressure. They respond consistently, not emotionally. They reinforce standards even when speed would make it easier not to. This is the real work of change leadership, not charisma, not energy, not inspirational moments, discipline. Because systems don't drift on their own. They drift when leaders stop operating them deliberately. Everything in this series comes down to what you do next. Not what you now understand, but what you operate. Your first 30 days are not about rolling out a grand initiative. They are about reestablishing control of the system. You begin by diagnosing reality, not performance, not sentiment, but how work actually flows, where execution leaks, where capacity bends, where behavior quietly shifts under pressure. Next, you establish rhythm, not more meetings, consistent operating cadence, a rhythm that forces clarity, surfaces friction, and creates predictability under pressure. Then you remove friction deliberately, not heroically, not all at once. The goal isn't speed, it's stability. As stability forms, you activate performance intelligence. You start noticing what others don't: the hesitations, the micro delays, the early strain that never shows up on dashboards until it's too late. And finally, you reinforce culture, not with words, but with response. What gets questioned? What gets tolerated? What gets corrected in real time? This is where change leadership is learned, not in reflection, not in theory. Change leadership is learned through execution. By the end of this season, you don't just understand change differently, you are equipped to lead it differently. You now have a complete framework that explains why change fails and what actually makes it succeed. You have a toolkit that turns insight into action, not inspiration, not theory, not slogans, but structured leadership behavior under pressure. You have diagnostic clarity, the ability to see what's happening inside a system before metrics collapse, before morale drops, before leaders start guessing. And most importantly, you now have a leadership operating system, not a checklist, not a personality style, not a one-time transformation playbook, but a way of thinking, diagnosing, and acting that works whether you're leading a small team, a broken function, or an enterprise under strain. This matters because change is no longer an occasional event, it's a permanent condition. And from this point forward, you don't have to rely on instinct alone. You don't have to wait for failure to reveal itself. You don't have to react in fragments. You now have a system that lets you lead change deliberately, consistently, and responsibly. That's not confidence built on optimism. That's confidence built on structure. This is the part most leadership programs don't say out loud. Change is not something you install and walk away from. It doesn't stay fixed. Drift will return, pressure will rise, and systems, even well-built ones, will slowly decay without discipline. This doesn't mean your change failed. It means your system is alive. Every organization slowly bends toward the path of least resistance. Without leadership rhythm, behaviors soften. Without reinforcement, standards blur. Without attention, old shortcuts quietly reappear. The real question is no longer, can you lead change? The real question is, will you continue to operate it when the urgency fades, when the pressure shifts, and when no one is watching? Sustainable change is not maintained by moments of inspiration. It's maintained by leaders who understand that discipline, attention, and systems are never a one-time effort. They are a way of operating. This is not a warning. It's an invitation to maturity, because leaders who understand drift are the ones who prevent collapse. As we close this season, there's one final truth to leave you with. Your organization doesn't need another initiative. It doesn't need another framework, and it doesn't need a louder message. What it needs is a leader disciplined enough to see the system and brave enough to operate it. Change does not fail because people resist. It fails when systems are left unattended, when signals go unnoticed, when drift is tolerated, and when leadership becomes episodic instead of practiced. Over this season, you've learned how execution actually moves, how capability carries load, how culture reinforces behavior, and how performance intelligence lets you see the truth early while there's still time to act. These are not ideas to admire, they are disciplines to practice, because lasting change is not created by intensity, it's created by consistency. And sustainable leadership is not about being present once, it's about operating the system every day after the spotlight fades. If you do that, change doesn't just happen, it lasts. This is where the work truly begins. Everything you've learned this season was built to move you to this point, not for understanding, but for application. The workbook is where you diagnose your system. The appendices give you tools to operate under real pressure. The templates bring discipline to execution, capability, culture, and performance intelligence. And the playbook builder allows you to design a change system that fits your organization, not someone else's framework. This is not a checklist. It is not a one-time initiative. It is a leadership practice. Change doesn't hold because leaders care. It holds because leaders operate it consistently, deliberately, and visibly. This is not the end of the work. This is the beginning of your practice. What you've built across this season isn't a mindset, it isn't inspiration, and it isn't another leadership story. You now understand how change actually works. You can see systems, not symptoms. You know how execution, capability, culture, and performance intelligence operate together. That doesn't make change easy, it makes it possible. The work doesn't end here, because real leadership never does. Change isn't something you launch, it's something you operate, day after day, under pressure, when no one is watching. Stay disciplined, stay alert, stay mission ready.